Okay, I'm going to get going. First of all, I would like to welcome the audience. This is the inaugural public seminar book event. We're going to be doing this regularly throughout the summer. So we invite you to come back to publicseminar.org to look and see when the next event is. We're particularly pleased this evening to have this group of wonderful authors who are all contributors and an editor to the book Believe Me. And I'd like to introduce them now. Samantha Irby, who writes a blog called Bitches Gotta Eat. She is the author of 3 books, including the current New York Times bestseller, Wow, No Thank You. Tatiana Maslany is an Emmy Award-winning actor known for her work in Orphan Black, Stronger, Pink Wall, and Network, which is on Broadway or was on Broadway. She is Canadian. Sabrina Hersi Issa is a human rights technologist and founder of Survivor Fund, a political fund dedicated to championing the rights of sexual violence survivors. She serves as Chief Executive Officer of Be Bold Media, a global digital agency, and leads organizing for Rights by Tech, a forum for technologists and activists. And Jaclyn Friedman is a longtime anti-violence activist, author, and advocate for women, and a co-editor with Jessica Valenti of Believe Me. Welcome, friends, and welcome to this public seminar event. Our participants are continuing to enter. But I'd like to get started by telling the group how things are going to go. We're going to take a couple of minutes where Jaclyn is going to tell us about the origins of Believe Me, the editorial process, who it's for, and what we hope its impact will be. She's going to do a short reading from her essay, The Cost of Disbelieving. I think that's what you're going to read from, Jaclyn, though if you want to read from the introduction, that's fine. We're then going to have readings and comments from Samantha, Tatiana, and Sabrina, who are going to read from their essays. That'll take up about a half an hour. We're going to start a moderated discussion at around 7:30, 7:35. And that's, we're going to have people talking to each other about their work for about 10 minutes. And then at 7:45, we're going to invite the audience in for a Q&A. I will be moderating the questions, but you can put your questions in the Q&A section. In fact, you can put your questions in anytime you like. I may sort of group some of them together so we can get as many people in as possible. And then before we close, we'll just have a few thoughts from the panelists about the future of their work and the future of this book. So to get us going, Jaclyn, 10 years ago, you were involved in the debate over sexual consent that produced the book Yes Means Yes, which was a really, really important book in establishing affirmative consent as a standard for sexuality. Now we're at a stage where women actually are speaking out, but they're only sometimes viewed as trustworthy witnesses. You say in your introduction that we're at a tipping point where something like trusting women could happen and believing women could happen. What are the implications for sexual assault survivors and for the larger culture for creating a world where we actually believe what women say?
I think the way I want to answer that question is to first define what we mean by believe me, because we're in the middle of yet another moment where there's all this bad faith discussion about what believe me means, and that oh, we mean believe all women all the time, regardless of any context. Believe me and believe women, believe survivors, which are, of course, significantly overlapping, but not the same ideas, means 2 things in specific. One is that we treat women as credible, right? That we assume until we have evidence to the contrary that women are credible, which is exactly how we already treat men. And the second equally important component is that we treat women as important, because when we only afford women credibility, we see what happened to Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, right? Who literally, Donald Trump said that she was a very credible witness, but the GOP senators decided that she wasn't important enough to derail the Kavanaugh nomination. So we have to be assumed to be credible, and that we have to be treated as though what we're saying is important enough that we need to like be able to act on it even when it's politically inconvenient.
Yeah.
I'm sure we're going to get into more specifics about that, but if we were to make that shift, which sounds so basic but also is so far from the world we live in, even more so when it comes to women of color, when it comes to trans women, it really would transform nearly everything about the culture we live in and our institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I was in an online chat with Rebecca Traister the other day, and one of the things we were talking about, the Tara Reid accusations against Joe Biden, and one of the things she said is, I like to think about it as listen to all women. What's the difference between listening and believing? Because I was sort of thinking about that as I was talking to her.
I mean, I think it's a little semantic,
Uh-huh.
and I'm not hung up on which word we use. I'm hung up on what we actually do.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
we can say that we're listening to women when we let women speak on television or to a reporter, and then we completely ignore what they say and act as though it's not important or there's no way it could be credible. Listening to women, believing women, means taking us seriously and affording us the same benefit of the doubt and importance that you would a man.
And I think, you know, part of what you're saying here, if I'm not wrong, is actually as a culture, we're not good at listening, period. So making the jump to believe or assume that a woman is a credible reporter of her own experience is really a good baseline.
Yeah, it is. And we're just a long way from there. And I don't know, I hope you don't mind. It's a good place to transition to the excerpt that I was going to read from my essay.
Fantastic.
Because it jumps in right at that particular idea. The truth underlying the public health crisis of women's believability is even worse than it looks. That's because social researchers have long demonstrated that it's not just that we hold women to much higher standards than we do men before we believe them. It's more perverse than that. We prefer not finding women credible. As a culture, we hate to believe women, and we penalize women for forcing us to do so. In other words, as women's credibility increases, especially in ways that defy gender norms, our social likability decreases. And here it's impossible not to think in the moment about Elizabeth Warren. We become shrill bitches, ball busters, too aggressive, too bossy, intolerable know-it-alls. It is not enough that we demand women clear a much higher bar than men do to prove our trustworthiness. We're mad when women manage to succeed anyway, and we all pay the price for that anger. Some of the losses are literally immeasurable. I know of no woman who doesn't house inside her the nagging feeling that maybe what she has to say is not that important or will cause too much trouble or will put her in danger. I know of no woman who has not at least some of the time allowed that feeling to prevail, to smother her impulse to speak. I'm haunted by the losses to humanity those infinite silences represent. What inventions and innovations are we suffering without? What tragedies proceeded unprevented? What kindness and community are we starving for that we could be sustained by had we not silenced ourselves? For that matter, what offerings could we be benefiting from if women simply didn't have to work so hard to prove our credibility to ourselves and others? How many hours of our lives have been stolen from us in this way? And yet still today, how many women does it take to overcome the credibility of one man? It took 60 for sexual abuse allegations to become credible against Bill Cosby, for Harvey Weinstein to be credibly accused and now convicted of sexual harassment and assault. The number is more like 80. For some, we have yet to find the number. Over a dozen have accused Donald Trump of sexual assault, and he is still President of the United States. Women ourselves are far from immune to gender disbelief. In one 2015 Harvard study, almost a quarter of the teen girls preferred male political leaders over female ones, and only 8% of the girls expressed a bias in favor of women leaders. Ultimately, the systemic disbelief of women is less about actually seeing women as untrustworthy and more about fearing what happens if we are able to step into our full power. Not that this distinction matters in practice. Do anti-abortion activists really think women are so easily duped by doctors, or is it just more convenient for them to blame doctors and posit women as frail-minded and in need of protection than it is to admit that they just want to dictate what we do with our bodies? Do we not believe that trans women know themselves better than we do? Or do we just fear how destabilizing it is to admit that gender is a construct? The damage is done either way. But it's important to understand how deeply rooted this dynamic is. As has been observed of many oppressive institutions, the delegitimization of women's authority isn't the unfortunate side effect of a broken framework. It's the grease that makes the entire system go. Women's erasure is an essential part of the deal powerful men have always made with the men they would have power over. Let me have control over you, and in turn, I will ensure you can control women. It's the same bargain white women make when they support white supremacist men in power. If I acquiesce to your demeaning me because of my gender, you will at least allow me to demean others because of their race. There is one meaningful way in which the fearmongers are right. Because the existing power structure is built on female subjugation, female credibility is inherently dangerous to it.
Thank you so much, Jaclyn. That's very powerful. And I'm going to ask the audience, thank you for sending in your questions. We're going to hold them for a little while and get to our other readings, and then we'll bring your questions back in. Samantha, we're going to turn to you and your essay, Big Little Lies.
Okay. I am going to start like halfway through. I woke up from a nap on a Sunday afternoon with a stomach ache, and not an ordinary stomach ache. It felt like there was an alien trapped under my skin, a hot, throbbing alien made of boiling lava, and possibly a mid-sized Chevy sedan. I had never before felt pain as searing and horrible as what was coursing through my gut. It was so bad I couldn't even zip my jeans. My then boyfriend wouldn't come with me to the hospital, probably because he had big plans to jerk off and play video games. So 2 hours later, I laid in a sterile white bed under sizzling fluorescent lights, totally alone, with tubes in my arms and more tubes up my nose, signing a surgery consent form through vision blurring fear tears, because my bowel was obstructed and twisting on itself like a pretzel. And if someone didn't fix that shit, I was probably going to perforate my bowel and die. At the time, I had no idea that I had Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease that causes inflammation of the lining of the digestive tract. It can affect any part of the digestive tract, from the mouth to the anus, but is particularly fond of the small intestine. At least mine is, and she is located in my ileum, the end piece of my small intestine that connects it to my large one. Potential side effects: bone loss, eye problems, back pain, arthritis, liver swelling, gallstones, and skin problems. My joints hurt, and my skin is disgusting. Can't wait until my eyes fall out of their sockets and my bones shatter every time a strong wind blows. So Crohn's is an immunodeficiency disease, which means that the cells in my body that are supposed to protect against infection don't recognize food and normal harmless bacteria that are in my intestine. Let's break it down this way. An innocuous piece of bread is trying to make its way from my mouth and out of my body into a toilet. It's pretty smooth, cilia sailing, but only until the second it hits these old guts. My receptor cells, which should be like, oh, hello food, what's up delicious nutrients, instead are all intruder and flood my intestines with little soldiering white blood cells armed to the teeth to fight off the enemy. And while they are entrenched in battle, swords and spears and bayonets ablaze, I am in a ridiculous amount of pain, like childbirth pain, which is typically followed by a torrent of bloody shit and much humiliated apologizing to whomever I happen to be hanging out with at the time. Years of this gnarly infighting, think Capulets and Montagues, Israel and Palestine, Biggie and Tupac, have left my intestines a veritable wasteland of scar tissue. Picture the circumference of your average drinking straw. Now imagine shoving a chicken breast through it. To be fair, a chewed up chicken breast, but I think you get what I'm saying. There are parts of my intestines that are so thick with useless scar tissue that whatever I eat has just that teeny tiny passageway to squeak through. And with all that tussling and fighting going on around it, food rarely survives the journey intact. Needless to say, that first time I limped into the emergency room, clutching my abdomen and trying not to breathe too deeply, lest lightning bolts of agony rip through my insides, I was in a lot of pain. And since it was the first time anything like that had ever happened to me, I didn't have the words to explain what was actually going on. I just cried and cut my stomach and begged for someone to make it stop. One of the first doctors I saw over the course of that interminably long evening, a young man whom I'd never met, who had the last few years of my body's history attached to a clipboard in his hand, asked whether I might be exaggerating the severity of my pain, fudging it a little bit, to get my hands on some morphine. First of all, it's not like they give you a whole lot, at least not enough to fake the most brutal intestinal pain of my life. I feel like there are way less dramatic ways to go about getting a couple pain pills. Second, imagine having to convince someone in an emergency room of all places that you are hurting. How do you prove that it feels like your internal organs are in a vice? And why is your word not good enough? I'm an expert in one thing, me. You're gonna have to trust that I know what I'm talking about. That night, my temperature was elevated and my heart rate was faster than usual. And obviously, since I'm some sort of magician, I just willed them higher because it couldn't possibly be that all my systems were freaking out in response to this blinding pain. There was nothing in my chart to indicate that I'd ever displayed drug-seeking behavior. Why would I lie about it? Or why not just give me the benefit of the doubt? I mean, if he had accused me of trying to get a double shot of antihistamines or a bump of beta blockers, then sure, there might be some evidence to back that up. But at that point, I'd never been prescribed anything more exciting than amoxicillin. I vomited into a bedpan as he suggested, again, that my pain might not be as bad as I'd described. He ordered a CT scan and got me some steroids. Later, when the pictures of my insides showed my intestines coiled like a broken slinky, he sheepishly came into the room and assured me that a nurse was on the way with some pain meds, the good kind. I've been battling chronic illness for years, and I'm sorry to report that my experiences in doctor's offices haven't improved as much as I'd like on the whole taking me at my word front. But I have gotten better at advocating for myself and demanding better care, despite how daunting that can feel. I understand that my pain is valid, that I'm worthy of their best care, and I try to make sure that they understand it too. So even if it takes storming into their offices with a bullhorn, here's hoping that doctors start listening to us when we tell them what we need and that they take us seriously. Professors and police officers and that faceless drone pushing papers around your company's HR department too. We deserve to be believed when we say we are in pain. Then maybe they can save their side-eyed glances and barely disguised skepticism for the women who walk in saying, who, me? Everything's great, I'm fine.
Samantha, thank you so much. And that was Samantha Irby, and we're here discussing Believe Me, How Trusting Women Can Change the World. Our next reader is Tatiana Maslany, who's going to read from her essay, Innocent in the Face.
So I'll probably just talk a bit about it just because it's a conversation between Jaclyn and I, and it sort of came from when I did Jaclyn's podcast, and we were talking about, I'm an actor and have been since I was 9 years old. So we were talking about how early in my career was marked by myself playing a lot of sexual assault survivors from a young age. This was something that was always reinforced to me as being like an important aspect of being a woman, was these stories specifically and embodying those stories. And, you know, it sort of became very apparent to me that there were a lot of, not only, you know, that this is a trope often in television or film, but also just the way in which the demands on which they put on me to perform it a certain way, to come at it with, you know, the fact that my face looked innocent allowed me a credibility or a victimhood that was helpful for the storytelling. Helpful for whatever that required in terms of moving the plot ahead or imbuing it with a certain emotional impact. And that was something that obviously as a young person became kind of an internalized thing for me as an actor, to learn that, you know, innocence or whatever it was, and that connection to sexual assault was like this strange, you know, this strange dynamic that played out. But the other thing was learning how to approach scenes from acting teachers who taught me that my sexuality was a weapon. So it was something that either it was a threat to me or it was a threat to someone else. So if I was sexual, it was a way to manipulate or to get my way. And if someone was sexual to me, it was a power thing, and it was, you know, abuse, and it was all of that. So there's a very fucked up, you know, sort of ideas that we are not only as actors embodying as young people, but also putting out into the world as these stories, that this is the way these stories should be told, and this is the true nature of these stories. What was I going to say about that? I wrote notes because I knew I'd be nervous. Yeah, it was, the idea of a weapon, the idea of sex as a weapon was, and the idea of, you know, manipulation and all of that. So Jaclyn and I talked also about Time's Up and where we are now. We're not on set anymore, but when I was on set after Time's Up, the conversation was often from men, oh, now I don't know how to behave, and I don't know how to be free, and I don't know, da-da-da-da. And for me, this just sort of is the way that women and queer people and people of color have always had to move through the world, which is we always have to be aware of how we are being perceived, how we are going to be safe by, you know, how we engage with people, how we project, what we're projecting out into the world is so, we have to curate it in a way to be safe. And so for men to be pissed off that now they have to have some consideration around how they are moving through the world is an interesting thing that we also discussed. And yeah.
Tatiana, thank you so much. We're here, for those of you who have just joined us, discussing Believe Me, How Trusting Women Can Change the World. And I've already learned some really important things to take into our general discussion. And I'd like to turn now to Sabrina Issa, who will read from her essay, Survivorship is Leadership.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So I first wanted to start by acknowledging that I join you from the territory of Nacostic, Piscataway territory, otherwise known as Washington, D.C. And I share this because it's really important to highlight that we acknowledge the Indigenous territory, even though we're meeting in a virtual digital context. So if folks are interested in checking out whose land that you happen to occupy, I really endorse this resource, native-land.ca. And you can find out for yourself over there. On Twitter, it's @nativelandnet. And I found that to be a really valuable resource. So thank you for that. And then also thank you to the other folks here. I don't know if you experienced this, I loved hearing your pieces, and I haven't read my piece in a while and I almost forgot what I wrote. I was like, oh, I wrote that. That's really dope. So I'm gonna share a small passage that's kind of the heart of Survivor Fund, which is what the essay and my framework of leadership is about. And actually, when I was starting Survivor Fund, I even remember Jaclyn, we emailed when I first had this idea like several years ago, when I was like, should this be a thing? And she was like, yes, this should be a thing. So thank you for that encouragement then. So here's a part of the essay that kind of gets to the theory of change what I was going for. Despite the costs and the risks to their health, safety, and social status, we are living through an era in which sexual violence survivors are our country's chief vanguards of truth and moral leadership. This comes as no surprise to me. I believe survivorship is its own leadership, and I believe that to be free of our culture, to free our culture from sexual violence, we must turn to these leaders as possibility builders and the new faces of broader power. Survivors can hold identities and experiences that are not only intersectional and nuanced, but always richer and deeper than the rigid roles of strength and resilience accorded to them. Survivors, political analyses, and systems expertise are exactly what our culture should follow when we seek to answer the question, where do we go from here? It is vital to hold this truth firmly. We are the ones we've been waiting for, and the ones who, through relentless resourcefulness, have successfully endured the exact violent systems that must be remade. These systems have created a dynamic where more often than not, we are governed by fear than by representative democracy. As Audre Lorde writes, we are taught to respect fear more than ourselves. But what is shame training us to fear? Power. For survivors and our communities, the personal is more than political. It lights the path toward a more just, peaceful future that holds diverse, expansive potential to restructure political power beyond the institutionally entrenched white, male, patriarchal standard. It recognizes that sexual violence survivors exist across the gender spectrum, expands the humanity of survivors beyond flat identity to them, and tells a new story about what change can look like. In the absence of political leaders who show up for women and survivors are showing up for themselves. And without any safeguards in place, using their voices to bring dirt into the light. There are survivors elected and working in institutional halls of power who push the issue of sexual violence out of the shadows and into the light. This happens each time Wisconsin Congresswoman Gwen Moore leads the charge to strengthen the Violence Against Women Act, imploring fellow members of Congress that no woman should ever feel afraid in her own neighborhood and home. No woman should ever have to endure the physical and psychological pain of domestic violence. Yet too many women continue to live in fear. It happens when California Congresswoman Jackie Spear leverages her public platform to elevate the issue of sexual violence, like when she invited congressional staff members organizing for sexual harassment policy reforms to be her personal guest at the State of the Union in 2018. From Congress to city councils, the number of survivors' voices in elected halls of power are few but mighty, and we must create opportunities to elect more of them. Our country deserves more survivors elected to office because we deserve a political system that reflects and champions our collective humanity, whose leadership demonstrates again and again the strength to not succumb to the weight of shame and resource the services, programs, and policies that support the kind of world that we deserve.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That's wonderful. And for those guests who have just joined us, we are here talking about the collection, Believe Me, How Trusting Women Can Change the World. I want to note at this time that you can buy this book at your local independent bookstore. I know many bookstores are closed, but most of them are taking orders. You can order through them and go pick it up. You can also order it. I got my copy from Powell's, which really need your business now. They're kind of on the rocks. You can go to bookstore.org or you can go to IndieBound. Wherever you go, buy this book. It's really worth reading and you're going to enjoy it. I want to turn to a moderated discussion now, and I want to sort of spring off what is really implicit in all of the essays you're reading, which is storytelling. stories told about women that seemingly everybody wants to hear. But people don't want to hear stories when women tell their own stories. And Samantha, the essay you were reading makes me think about how disadvantaged women of color particularly are in the medical system. And there's this sort of persistent idea that women of color don't know their own bodies at all. And the rates of getting poor care are dramatically lower than the care delivered to white women. So I wonder if each of you would speak to the question of storytelling. How do women get their own stories out there and push back on the stories that people want to tell about us?
Okay, I'll start. I think for me, at least in my own work, it has been really important to, and I understand that this is not a thing everyone can do, but to be as sort of brutally honest as possible. It's hard, especially like if you have families who don't really want to hear what you're saying. But I think one of the things that I have found with the way people react to my work is they are always like, thanks for saying that. And I love hearing that, or I relate to that because it comes from a really honest place. So I feel like the more of us who feel like we can talk about things, and it doesn't have to be like, listen, I write like a lot of fart jokes and stuff. It doesn't have to be literature. But I think the more of us who are like talking about things the way they are and sort of connecting that way, the better. At least I always feel like if somebody's like really laying it out, I'm like, oh yeah, I feel like that too. I'm glad she's talking about that. I think especially when bad things happen to you, it can feel like it exists in a vacuum and that you're the only person who's had this bad experience and everyone else is just like going to at least in this case, going to the doctor and having a great time and having a really open relationship and getting the pills they need. And that didn't happen for me. But when I started being like, so does anybody else like get told to you take a Tylenol like when their leg is broken? And then other people are like, oh, me too, me too. I think the honesty or being honest about these things for women can help us connect to each other and kind of break some of those walls down. Like it's hard to think that you're the only person experiencing something. And I always find it, even if I'm not going through that exact thing, I always find it reassuring to hear other people talking about what's really going on with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to tell the truth. And it's
Yeah.
I'm just to dovetail on your points, Samantha, is it's hard to tell the truth. And so I want to be a part of building a culture of bravery. And so when I do it, when I see writing and storytelling that like helps me feel seen, I like to tell the person, thank you. And like, because I know that it was probably like they practiced bravery in doing that. And I don't want that to go unrewarded or unacknowledged, because it helps me be brave and it helps me feel less alone. It's kind of from a selfish place. Yeah. But it like, I hope that it just creates this like culture where we feel safe to be brave.
I think similar to that idea, like as an artist, I always find that following the fear is actually where you find the most connection and the most reveal and the most honesty. Is like, where am I most vibrating? What's the scariest place to go? Vulnerability being like a beautiful, laudable thing, as opposed to a place of weakness or whatever it can be deemed as, you know, and that vulnerability and openness in a time of fear can be so connecting.
And Jaclyn, I just want to, before you answer, take you back to Yes Means Yes, which you wrote in response to the No Means No narrative, which you said, no, that's sex negative. It is putting it on women to control men. let's go with a story that's about yes. You know, you were really one of the first people to talk about it that way. So yeah, sorry.
I don't know that that's true. I mean, Antioch started talking about that in the early 90s. I was fortunate enough to be one of the first people who broke through talking about it, but I want to give credit where it's due. I think that talking about which kind of stories and being deliberate about which stories we're telling is really important. There's a wonderful essay in Believe Me by Catherine Cross, which is in part about Gamergate, but really jumps off from that and is about how being believed is not enough, because there is also a level in which when women especially tell our stories of being victimized, we're believed in a way that is patronizing and that doesn't involve change, but involves this sort of great venting of victimhood, and like we all feel like, oh, these brave women have said these difficult things and isn't that wonderful, and let's go back to the status quo. And so I think that in terms of storytelling, it's so important, and I agree with everything everybody said and want to uplift it, but I think that we need to be thoughtful and choiceful when we're telling our own stories about what we want, what our goal is in telling our own stories and what we hope will happen, and let that inform the ways we tell those stories. One of the things that's we had in common, both in Yes Means Yes and in Believe Me, is that we asked all the contributors not just to talk about what's happening now, stories of what's difficult now, but also stories about what the future world could be like if we could make this wonderful shift. And I think that stories, not just of pain, but also when we're able to, and this is a hard lift, right? Like the number one note we sent back to contributors for Believe Me was like, where's the future vision in this? It's hard to do, especially when we are struggling with oppression and pain, but when we're able to make that imaginary future space for people to enter into, it can be so motivating for change in a way that only ever hearing people's stories of pain sometimes can leave people feeling paralyzed and overwhelmed.
That's a really good point. I want to throw another question out to the group, and this is inspired by somebody in our audience, Esper Bergman, who thinks your book is amazing, and from Bear, I think that's lovely. Bear says, you know, it's good to inspire other people to try and write about their own experiences, but writing about your experiences of not being believed and of being a survivor isn't easy. And what are your suggestions for people who are embarking on telling their own story and navigating some of that pain to putting your experiences into words? What advice do you have for that?
I mean, I was so afraid to contribute to this book. Like I was so afraid to have any say, to put my words on paper, to the extent that Jaclyn and I ended up making it a dialogue. So for me, that allowed me to, because it was somehow a collaborative thing, allowed me to open up in a different way. And for me, that I think having someone to bounce things off of is really important. Someone who asks difficult questions, someone who probes you, who loves you and sees you and wants to hear your story. I think that can be really helpful. And that certainly was my process in how I came to it.
Samantha or Sabrina?
Telling the truth, like I said, go ahead. Like I said with following Samantha's last comments, telling the truth is hard, especially when you're telling your truth. And it is, at least for me, been a process. And what I offer to the person who's asking that question is to honor whatever way that process looks for them. So sometimes you're maybe not telling the truth out loud and in public yet, but you're saying it to yourself, or you're saying it to a piece of paper, or you're saying to someone who loves you, who will love you no matter what. And to be kind to themselves, because it's your process and it gets to look like whatever you want it to look like.
I would say like almost the same thing. Don't put any pressure on yourself. And I think a piece of advice that I don't hear enough is to not think about the audience. I mean, if you're writing with like where it's gonna be published or where it's gonna end up in mind, I think that can make a thing scarier than just writing it to write it. My own work, I'm always like, well, this is for me first, and then if I can do something with it, that's great. So I would say not to put any pressure on yourself or to think about who might be reading it other than you.
I don't have anything to add to that great wisdom, but I do want to say that S. Bear Bergman is a wonderful storyteller, and you should do a Google if you're interested in some wonderful queer storytelling.
Absolutely. Well, let's sort of jump on queer storytelling, because we had a question come in from a fan of the book, Roberto Garcia, who thinks it's just an incredible resource, as he says, for a cis, white, passing, male, able-bodied, middle-class professor like myself. And thank you. The question is to Tatiana and Jaclyn, but I think we could extend it to everyone. What are some of the queer films, television shows, books that you would recommend? Not just that people would enjoy to really keep thinking about this, but maybe for some of us who are teachers to weave into our classes to get students thinking about these issues.
Samantha's books.
Samantha's books, okay.
Let's start there. She's got 3 of them.
Okay, all right. Samantha's book. What does Samantha read? What would Samantha suggest?
I mean, I only read garbage, so we're not going to talk about what
but there's useful garbage.
I will say that so this is a little selfish because I just worked on the 2nd season, but the 1st season of Work in Progress on Showtime, which is about a woman, Abby McEnany, who identifies as a fat queer dyke. She starts dating a trans man, and it's so funny and like loving and compassionate. And it's the kind of show we just don't get to see. It's like, you know, there are very few things like it, especially on big networks. So I would say just to like laugh, but also to kind of expand, you know, what you're watching, to watch Work in Progress, because it's incredible.
They had me when she bored her therapist to death. I mean,
that's not even a spoiler. I mean, like, it just goes so much further than that. It's genius. It's genius.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I actually think that's a magnificent show. Tatiana, Sabrina, do you have any suggestions for Roberto?
I mean, I'm not in the industry. Tatiana, by all means.
I literally, whenever I get this question, I forget everything I've ever seen, read, any of it.
Right.
The only thing, this is not actually like, this is just the one thing that's been getting me through quarantine, is this TV show. And it's not queer, but the storytelling is extremely unlinear in a way that is sort of what Jaclyn and I talked a little bit about, is like imagining new structures of storytelling, ways that stories can be told that are different shapes than the kind of convention. But it's called, I feel so dumb, but it's called The Midnight Gospel, and it's like a cartoon based on a podcast. And it's just so imaginative and so of this world, but not, and it's emotional, and it's funny and weird and everything, and I love it. But
amazing.
I can't think
Tatiana, you're the one who texted me to say go see Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
Oh yeah, I mean, yes, like no question. Did you?
And also, oh my god.
Yeah.
And also obviously Steven Universe. Yes. And then I would also say, if you're talking about books and academics, I have to give a shout out on 2 ends of the spectrum back to S. Bear Bergman, whose line of children's books, Flamingo Rampant, are a great way to start them young, and I think actually should be taught. And very academic, Julia Serrano, who's also a Believe Me contributor, has written some brilliant books. Whipping Girl changed my entire relationship to masculinity and femininity. She's a queer trans theorist and just writes fucking brilliant books. So those are some off the top of my head.
And you know, anybody who's into serious reading, I just finished Jen Mannion's Female Husbands, which is about women who became female husbands in the 19th century. And it's a sort of prehistory of modern transgender. It's beautifully written. She's an academic historian, but she doesn't write like one. You'll be glad to know. So if you're looking to really sort of dig into transgender history, go with that. Samantha, you were going to
offer, especially for this moment we're in, fighting COVID, How to Stop a Plague.
Yeah.
There's a documentary about HIV activists pushing back on the CDC and the former administrations basically creating a genocide. And that's really timely, timeless, and inspiring.
I just thought of two things now. We're Here, which is this beautiful, which is amazing. It's 3 drag queens who go into smaller communities in the States and kind of do drag with 3 kind of people who would never normally do it, or who are budding drag queens themselves, and it's just so beautiful and so just so moving. And the other one is, and now I forget it, never mind, I'll come back to it, but that one's amazing.
Excellent. So just for the people who have recently joined us, we're here talking about Believe Me, How Trusting Women Can Change the World, a wonderful collection of essays edited by Jaclyn Friedman, and we have 3 contributors here. I want to ask a question of my own. How will trusting women change the world? Tell me something big that's going to happen from trusting women. That you see, that's not even within our grasp yet, but that we can see out there on the horizon.
It will change the entire structure of the internet.
All right, follow that up.
I mean, that's Soraya Shamali's essay, so people should definitely read it. But literally, the internet has been constructed by mostly cis straight white guys, right? They're the ones who hold and get most of the VC funding. They're the ones who decide what the rules are that we have our discourse by. I mean, one of the things that I'm noticing right now that is quite galling, which I think is basically is the platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube who are suddenly like, yeah, we are absolutely going to employ a bunch of people to filter out any garbage about COVID-19, where, activists have been on these platforms for many years to have them filter out garbage that is hateful about women and people of color and trans people, and and they were like, we couldn't possibly do that, and now they're like, oh, we can do that because that's our priority. And so if we trust and believe in women's leadership, and by the way, the secret theme of this book, which Sabrina's essay is the Rosetta Zone too, is the relationship between our disbelief of women when it comes to violence and pain and our disbelief in women as leaders. If we believe in women's leadership, if we start actually investing in women, it will truly change the way our discourse happens, literally on a coding, on an infrastructure level. That's one.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Tatiana, Sabrina, Samantha, how will believing women change the world?
It'll certainly make our lives easier. I feel like moving as a woman through the world, just kind of not having to explain yourself 10 times, will take a little bit of the burden of being a person off of us. And I feel like anything that makes moving through life, I mean, because, we live in hell, anything that makes getting through this hell easier is going to be a good change for everyone.
Great. Tatiana and Sabrina, want to jump in? Well, Tatiana, maybe I can follow up with a question from the crowd, from Daisy Thurlow. Daisy says, you've been an inspiration in all of your work, working in empowering shows for women such as Orphan Black. How would you describe how the Me Too and Time's Up movements affected people on film and TV show sets? What changed and what still needs to change?
I think a lot needs to change still. I think it's such early days. And I find, you know, it's certainly not an after time's up kind of situation. It's like we're all talking about, it's like structural changes need to be in place. And it's still in a reactionary period where it seems like people talk about the fact that now they can't do this or they can't do that, or there's intimacy coordinators now on set who actually are there. Their job is to dictate how a sex scene or an intimate scene plays out, and to have consent on all fronts. And it's like a contract now that's way different than it used to be. But it still is majority, you know, men on set, and you know, things that it's still really embedded in that culture that it is kind of a playground. So a lot needs to change. And I think that comes down to also, in the same way, believing women, which brings them into writers' rooms, which brings them into positions of power on set, behind the camera in a different way than we've ever seen before. You know, if the majority of people on set were female, I wonder what that would look like, what that would feel like, what kind of work would come from that kind of place, because I think it would be vastly different. It just would inherently be, and yeah, so I'm excited for what's to come.
It's interesting to hear you describe that, Tatiana. I know nothing about the television industry. I do have a friend in the feminist pornography business, and what you are describing about the intimacy contract, that's what they've been doing for 40 years on feminist porn sets.
Really?
I mean, it's not like this was a mystery.
Yes, right. For some reason, we didn't get that memo.
For some reason, yeah, I can't imagine
Been
why.
waiting over here.
Yeah. Sabrina, how does Believing Women going to change the world?
So I have two North Stars for that, and one of it is informed a lot. Samantha, when you in your essay you said, you know, how do we prove that we are hurting? And right now, it's that they don't believe us when we say we're in pain. Right. The only accountability in a system like a healthcare system is that it has to cost them to not believe us, and that's not the world that I want. We as a patient, you have rights, et cetera. But I believe that believing women will mean it will no longer cost us. Like we won't be living in a world of pain anymore. Yeah. So that's one North Star. And then the second North Star is that the outcome of a world where it will no longer cost us and we won't have to exist in pain and survive pain and endure. We will then get to restructure power. And that's where I lean into, is that a world where we get to reimagine the systems and reimagine the way things are done, and we don't have to do it from a place of survivorship. We get to do it from a place where our full humanity is respected and acknowledged.
Is she dropped out for anyone but me?
No, I lost the signal. Sabrina, we've lost your signal temporarily.
Oh, there she is.
Are you back?
I'm back.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Where did I drop off at?
I'm not
fair my run for
Senate. We won't be leading from survivorship. We'll be leading from power and not,
from being fully seen.
Yeah. Well, speaking of fully seen and pain, we have a question from Laura, who wants to know, how can we get past the stigma about mental health and people not believing how badly we're struggling? People sort of tell people with emotional disabilities that they just need to get over it, and why can't they pull themselves together? That's a form of pain that a lot of people are struggling with. What would trusting women about their own mental health, how do we get to that place?
Whew.
Yeah.
Stump the panel.
But could you conceptualize that question? What would it take to believe women that their mental well-being should be?
It's a form of pain, and that their mental well-being
absolutely is.
matters to us. Yeah. Yeah, but I think the questioner is saying, you know, as she moves through the world, it's simply not the case that people take it seriously, that she's in pain, because she doesn't look like she's in pain. And that sort of comes back, you know, Samantha, that doctor who encountered you didn't see you in the way you needed to be seen. So maybe this is a question of how do we insist that people see us?
Well, and there's this double-edged sword where it can be difficult, depending on what your challenges are, to be taken seriously, that you're in pain, emotional and mental distress. But that if you are able to convince someone that you are having mental health challenges, that is automatically used, especially if you're a woman, as a reason to discredit you about anything else that you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a double bind where, you know, how hard am I going to work to say I'm having mental health challenges, I'm struggling with anxiety and depression, which, by the way, I am struggling with anxiety and depression right now, honestly, in a way that I have not ever before in my life. But, you know, is that going to get, am I going to hear about that on Twitter tomorrow as a reason not to believe me as an expert about something else, or about mental health, for that matter,
Right.
to paint, because that sort of like, oh, women are crazy, you're crazy, is used to discredit us and not see us all the time. It really is a double bind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially as a Black woman, they always are looking for, like, they're always going to, like, you're angry, you're crazy, you're unstable, da da da. All I can offer that mental well-being is a part of well-being, and these are, and a lot of the challenges with incorporating that in an inclusive nature to talking about trauma and survivorship is we're still finding language to put to this in a way where that is seen and fully recognized. So yeah, I want to just affirm and validate that these are real struggles and real issues, and they're just as valid in this space as any other part of it.
Yeah, yeah. So we have another question here. We only have a couple of minutes left to go, but I'm trying to find it. I can't see the name, but somebody asked, who are the people you admire? Okay, people on the screen are now excluded.
Oh, no.
But who are the women you admire, and who other women should be looking to for strength?
I mean, I already mentioned her once, but Soraya Chemaly is one of my absolute touchstones. I think she's one of the hardest working women in feminism, and she is fucking brilliant and is super real and, like, transparent about whatever's going on with her, but also does not ever seem to let it slow her down. And her book about women and anger, which is called Rage Becomes Her, like, really, like, changed me. And I don't think anyone before I read that book would have thought that I had an issue with anger. So Soraya Chemaly, and I've gotten the opportunity to collaborate with her on some activism and organizing projects, and had her be on my board of my organization. I've worked with her in a lot of capacities, and she's just an absolute powerhouse and always has something I need to hear.
Samantha?
I'm going to say this is a pretty obvious choice, I think, for me, but I tend to like my news and inspiration with like some acidic humor. Lindy West, I mean, we're friends, but I often read and reread Lindy's work all the time. She's so incisive. She's so good. And her new book, The Witches Are Coming, is incredible. And she has been, will always be a guiding light for me, for sure.
Fantastic. Tatiana, how about you?
Well, I've pulled up their Instagram because I don't know how to pronounce their name, but I love their poetry and their activism. Alok.
Alok, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
A-L-O-K.
Yeah. And they're just an incredible poet and performer and speaker and activist, and just really inspiring. And I always look to them for inspiration. Yeah.
Fantastic. Sabrina.
So I have some shout outs for people who inspire me, help me be a better version of me, and help me feel seen in the world. So first I want to give love to Aminatu So. She is a podcast host for Call Your Girlfriend and has a book coming out, Big Friendship. I was like, I can't remember the name. In July, and a wonderful human being and makes me a better me. I also love Joanne Reed from the MSNBC host, who is always bringing out, like, the panels are amazing, the commentary is on point. I try not to consume a lot of news right now, but like I consume that. A writer who helps me feel seen in the world, Veronica Chambers. She's at the New York Times leading special projects, but she is a prolific author, has like 16 books. I think like 5 of them are New York Times bestsellers, children's books, YA, nonfiction, all of it. And then the last is Ayanna, who's in my essay, Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who is just, you want to talk about someone who leads from a place where vulnerability is a strength. And I admire her leadership tremendously, and I consider her a national treasure.
Yeah. What an amazing group of women. And what an amazing group of women you are. Audience, I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of your questions. We've been here talking about Believe Me, How Trusting Women Can Change the World. There's a link in the chat. You can take that link to bookshop.org and buy the book, or you can go to PALS, or you can order from your local bookstore and help them come back after COVID-19. Wherever you get the book, get it, read it. It's an amazing book, and you can dig into the work that these wonderful women have done. And I want to thank all of you for coming to this public seminar book event. We've been so happy to have you, and I hope we're going to be in touch with you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, thank you for coming, friends. Okay, time's up.
Literally.
All right. Love you all.
Be well.
Bye.
Bye.